Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can hear me, Lord Chris.
I can, thank you.
Good. Well, that's a good start. I have to apologise that I'm not, as you will know, and as those who are sitting in Aldwych will know, I'm not physically present in the building. That's simply because at the moment I'm testing positive for COVID. Everyone will understand, therefore, why I can't be with you in person, but I am here. I am chairing the session. In a moment or two, you will be asked questions by Ms. Richards, but first let me explain the general arrangements to you. Then I want to say a few words to those who are watching, both here and online. But you will be speaking not just to those who are in front of you, who are members of the public, core participants or participants, those who are to the left, who are lawyers, amongst whom is Ms. Richards, who will be asking you the questions, and at the very back of the room, there may be representatives of the press. But your bigger audience lies beyond this room. It is online, those who are watching on YouTube or on live stream. It is, just to give you some idea of the numbers, they're likely to be more than 100 people watching and will watch throughout the day. In a moment or two, Ellie will ask you to take the oath. But first, can I let everyone know the arrangements which are necessary following the death of the late Queen? We will not, you will understand, be sitting next Monday, which is the public holiday for the late Queen's funeral. At the moment, I don't yet know precisely what rearrangements that will mean to our timetable, but there will be some, and as soon as those arrangements have been made, you will be told. Now let's proceed with today's hearings. Ellie, would you please?
Do you want to stand
Please
up?
state your full name.
Lord Edmund Nigel Ramsay Crisp.
Please take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Ms. Richards.
Lord Crisp, I'm going to start just with a brief overview of your career. You started working for the NHS in January 1986. In broad outline, what had you been doing before that time?
I had done a lot of different things. I had been a community worker working with young people in Liverpool for 5 years. I had worked in industry and I'd lived abroad.
Now, your work in January 1986 was as Unit General Manager of what was then termed a mental handicap unit, part of East Berkshire Health Authority. Again, in broad terms, what was your role and what were your responsibilities in that position?
I wonder if I might just make a remark just to preface
Yes,
this,
of course.
if I may. I just wanted to say somewhere at the beginning, to offer my deepest sympathies to the people who have been infected and affected by what must be the most cruel nightmare. And may I also just add that having looked at these papers over what's happened over the last 40 years, I can see that the system has not served people well. And I don't know, Sir Brian, if I'm sure you'll want me to expand on that at some point. I'm happy to do that now, or would be very happy to do that later on at a more appropriate point, perhaps.
Perhaps we'll come back to that, Lord Crisp, after we've explored a number of the issues arising from the documents. I'll pick up on that and ask you to expand upon it.
Please do, yeah.
But I think, is it right to say you say that as someone who spent much of your working life working for and with the NHS?
Well, I spent 20 years in the NHS. I spent 16 years since, and I don't know, 10 or so years before. But it's a big chunk of my working life. But before that, I was working in community work and therefore actually with charities and so on.
So just then to pick up on your career path, just in short terms, what was your role as the unit general manager in that first post with East Berkshire Health Authority?
I was responsible for the management of a very small unit which had 2 residential, well, still called hospitals in those days, and several community mental health teams, community mental handicap teams as they was called in those days, which covered Windsor, Maidenhead, Bracknell.
And that was working with people who had learning disabilities?
That's right, that's the language we would use today.
Then in April 1988, you became Unit General Manager for Wexson Park Hospital, which was also part of East Berkshire Health Authority. Was Wexson Park Hospital a general hospital?
It was a standard district general hospital, so 600 beds, that sort of size.
And what did your job as Unit General Manager of that hospital entail?
Again, it was responsibility for the overall management and performance of that hospital and accountable to the District Health Authority, as you say.
And then in April 1991, I think your statement says 2001, but that's a straightforward
yes, I apologise for that.
Error. You became Chief Executive of Heatherwood and Wexson Park Hospital's NHS Trust on the formation of that trust. Was that essentially a different name for the same job, or was that a different job?
It was a merger of 2 previous units, Heatherwood Hospital Unit and Wexham Park Unit. So the 2 were merged and I was appointed General Manager.
You then, in July 1993, became Unit General Manager of the Churchill John Radcliffe Hospital, part of the Oxford Health Authority. And then in April 1994, Chief Executive of the Oxford Radcliffe Hospital's NHS Trust. Again, were you essentially in overall charge, overall responsibility for the management of the hospital?
Yes.
Now, in 1998, you moved to the NHS Executive. You became Regional Director for South Thames, first of all, and then the following year, Regional Director for London. Can you just assist us first in understanding what the NHS Executive was at that time?
The NHS Executive was a executive agency of the Department of Health. So the regional director level at that point became civil servants, although not part of the core Department of Health, if you like. And the regional director's responsibility was the region that they covered, for ensuring that essentially the management and performance of the units or the trusts within that region.
So would it be right to understand it, therefore, as a link between the hospitals, the NHS trusts, and the Department of Health?
Yes, I mean, that's certainly true. It was part of the Department of Health, but it was more management focused, if you see what I mean. So there wasn't very much of a linking activity. It was much more that they were responsible for that for the management of the organisations in that area. But it was an executive agency, so it was at arm's length, if you like, from the Department of Health.
So you were not involved at that point with policy making within the Department of Health?
Only in as much as it related to the management of hospitals.
Now, in November 2000, you took on a combined role of NHS Chief Executive and Permanent Secretary at the Department of Health. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. You were in that role until March 2006. In April 2006, you became a life peer, and you continue to be a working member of the House of Lords. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think you currently co-chair, or you have co-chaired, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global Health.
Yeah.
Can I then just come back to your time with the NHS between 1986 and 2000, just with some broad and general questions, if I may. How would you describe the role of management in general terms and in contrast with the role of clinicians within the NHS?
Right. The two overlap, actually, in a way that I'll explain in a moment. But firstly, the management job, I always reviewed it as trying to get the best deal for patients within the context of the policies of the day, because governments change and government policies change, and you'll appreciate in those 10 years we went from very different systems of managing the NHS. And so my job was really about, or management job was really about managing the resources to that end, and that meant the people, most importantly, and the money, and the facilities that you had. Individual clinicians' prime responsibility is to their patients. In all the units that I ran, and indeed when we came to the Department of Health, I involved doctors not just as advisors, but fully in the management of the organisation. So, for example, in Wexson Park, we had, I think, 12 doctors who managed particular clinical services. So one would be general medicine, another general surgery, another obstetrics and gynecology. So we had doctors who had dual roles, if you like, as an individual, their responsibility to their patient, but actually most doctors recognise they don't just have a responsibility to the patient in front of them, but to the patient population. And in that regard, it's very helpful for them to be part of the management that is organising and delivering the service. So a very tight relationship. And forgive me if any nurses in the room, it was also the nurses who very importantly played a very significant role in management.
In any of the hospitals in which you had a role in that period, did hospital management ever become involved in the question of what information should be provided to patients by clinicians? Or was that something essentially left to the judgment of clinicians?
Oh, no. I mean, we, at Wexham Park, as I recall it, we had a patient survey, for example, set up. This was quite early for such things, to understand what patients wanted from their hospital, but also to get feedback on services and so on. And as a result of that sort of activity, hospitals did provide, in those days, purely paper summaries, and Wexham Park was in an area with a very multicultural population, so we produced a lot of leaflets in different languages for that reason.
Do you recall, and again, this is in very general terms, I'm not talking about any specific treatment or medical product, but do you recall whether the hospitals would become involved in decision making about the kind of information about the risks of a pharmaceutical product or a procedure that should be provided to patients?
Well, I think there are two things there. One is there was, I can't remember the system in those days, but there would be a system for reporting complications and so on. So, but that would be essentially done by the clinicians, but I suspect that there would be some administrative support to them to do that, so that if somebody saw a strange reaction to a drug or something, it had to be reported through to what later became the MHRA, Medicine Healthcare Regulatory Authority. So there would be that sort of thing. But in terms of advising, well, in Oxford, we were also part of the we were also university hospital, so again it's slightly more complicated. So we were, and I did get involved to some extent in teaching medical students, and some of the sort of questions that we raised in those times, and these were fairly early for them to be raised, were things like breaking bad news, programs on courses on that, or indeed on information for patients. So there would be elements of that, but the main responsibility for that would be with the clinician.
Was there a culture, and I appreciate you can only speak here of the hospitals and areas with which you were involved, but was there a culture of deference to clinicians on the part of management?
To some extent, I think when I talk about clinicians, I mean all the clinical people, so it's doctors and nurses and physiotherapists and all the people who have a clinical role. I think you're probably specifically talking about doctors here,
Yes.
aren't you? Yes. I mean, the NHS has been fundamentally in transition for 30 years, moving away from a culture of 30, 40 years, a culture of deference and so on to clinicians, to one which, of course, some clinicians have rather resented over the period, of clinicians becoming much more accountable. And with that, you have seen some significant changes. And those hospitals in that time would be partway through that transition. So you'd see more teamwork and less individual decision-making happening. And certainly, as managers, one would encourage that. But it was a process of profound cultural change, really.
Do you have any recollection of the extent to which any of the hospitals with which you were associated undertook any examinations of the policies and practices of hospital doctors? Or was it only if something went wrong that something might then come to light? Was there any process of clinical audit, for example?
Oh, yes. I can't remember at Wexson Park, but the clinical audit was very heavily involved in Oxford. And Oxford as a university hospital had some tradition around that, so there were grand rounds and so on where cases were discussed. And it wasn't just where things were, there were mortality and morbidity reviews which were focused on, and I occasionally went to those, which were focused on particular issues. But there was processes of proper audit, yeah.
You've described in your statement some of the different ways in which hospitals organise themselves. Some would have medical directors, some would have a medical advisory committee, and so on. At that point, late 80s through into the 90s, was there any role for patients in any of those governing committees?
There was no, I think I'm right in saying that at the district health, when there were district health authorities, there wasn't somebody who was a patient's representative on it, although there were lay people, so it wasn't purely a professional committee. And there was a community health council in those days, and the community health council had a role of representation, and certainly I met with the community health council members in both the hospitals or both the trusts that I ran, and there were lots of informal processes. I don't know whether there were any hospitals or boards which had specifically patient representation.
Do you ever recall, in the hospitals in which you were involved, any discussions about blood transfusion practice?
I don't think so. Oxford shared a site with the blood transfusion service, still does, but I don't recall I would have visited it at some point, but I don't recall particular discussions about practice, certainly.
And do you recall having any role in the establishment of a hospital transfusion committee?
No.
I want to turn now to what will be the focus of the rest of my questions, which will be your role between 2000 and 2006 and your role at the Department of Health. Now, you had these two roles as NHS Chief Executive and as Permanent Secretary of the Department of Health. Can you explain to us, first of all, what each of those roles was?
Right. Well, the Department of Health and the NHS are distinct, and it's perhaps worth just drawing out that the Department of Health's responsibility is to support the government of the day with implementing their policies and with legislation and regulation. So they provide the framework within which the NHS is then responsible for service delivery. Now, there's some blurring of the edges there because you can imagine that some policies run across the two. But essentially the Department of Health is looking up to the minister and the NHS is looking out to the patient. So that's what those two roles were. Do you want me to talk about how they were combined? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
As I understand it, you were the only person to occupy the combined role, so it was a new idea when you took up the post. and when you left 6 years later, you recommended that they should be separated again and that there should be two separate roles, two separate individuals. So could you just explain your understanding of...
Yeah, my understanding of the background of that is that a new government came in 1997, New Labour, very activist, keen to make change in the NHS. The NHS was a public's major priority. And I think they were very disappointed that between 1997 and 2000, they didn't make very much progress in doing that. So in 2000, they set up what was called an NHS plan. They developed a plan with major involvement of patients, may I say, in looking at that. Set up a plan and decided they wanted to implement this with maximum vigour. And they decided that whilst doing that, they would bring together these two posts, two full-time jobs, I hasten to add, of Permanent Secretary of the Department of Health and NHS Chief Executive, in order, as I understand it, to get maximum leverage, you know, to make change happen. Because some of the things that were needed to implement the NHS plan would be things happening out there in the hospitals and in the GPs' clinics and so on. And some of the things that would be needed would be in the Department of Health, such as rapidly getting a focus on some changes in legislation to allow some of the changes that were wanted to be made. So I think they wanted to make sure this ran smoothly, so they decided to make it one unit. I have no idea whether that was envisaged as being something that might continue or not, but that was my understanding of why they decided to do that.
And when you retired in 2006, you recommended that it should revert to being two separate roles. Why was that?
Well, I think the decision to do that at the beginning was right. And I think that you'll have seen from my statement that enormous changes were made in the NHS, both in policy terms and, you know, waiting lists were brought down massively to figures you won't believe today, as it were, in today's circumstance. Big improvements in a lot of services. We could see that happening in about 2 or 3 years from my starting in the role. And at that time, and during that period, I was during my entire period, I was concentrating very much on the NHS. I was essentially the NHS Chief Executive, who was also a part-time Permanent Secretary. You know, if you like, if it had been a 5-day job, it would have been 1 day on the Permanent Secretary and 4 days on the others. It was, of course, a 7-day job, but in terms of the amount of work that was done, that needed to be covered. In order to manage to do that job, I needed to make sure that I had good delegation arrangements in place in the Department of Health. And I had, throughout that period, 2 first-class people. One was the Chief Medical Officer, who was essentially my deputy manager. He was accountable to me for the management of the bits of the department that dealt with clinical matters, including, of course, blood. And then I had a very experienced senior civil servant who was essentially my deputy in regard to things like how you do legislation and how you do regulation and all those, if you like, proper functions of a department. So that made sure that the department wasn't neglected, but it wasn't driven forward, would be my assessment of it. And we got to a point 3 years out where you could see the waiting list change, you could see the improvements coming through, and it was then important that instead of just dealing with the fact, if you like, the result of bad health, you started to deal with health as well, the health of the population, not just the sort of waiting lists and the clinical issues. And it was really important that, in my view, that the Department of Health then began to focus much more on health and didn't have to be the department for the NHS, you know, for the delivery, but for the health, if that's a distinction I can make. And before I resigned, I had come to the view that it was important to separate them again so that they had their own dynamism. As I say, I don't think they were neglected, but I don't think they had the dynamism you would have got from a single leader.
And if we can just put up a page from your witness statement, your first statement on screen, just to understand in very broad terms the difference between the two roles. Lawrence, it's WITN 3996001, page 4. paragraph 19, you say this: the two posts had different responsibilities. So I'll wait till we've got that. Can we zoom in on paragraph 19, Lawrence?
Yeah.
Thank you. The two posts had different responsibilities. As NHS Chief Executive, I was responsible for the management of the NHS in England and was the accounting officer to Parliament for its expenditure. As Permanent Secretary, I was responsible for the management of the Department of Health and the provision of support to the Secretary of State and Ministers, and was the accounting officer to Parliament for its expenditure. In both roles, I was personally accountable to the Cabinet Secretary and worked within the policies determined by the Secretary of State and Government. So that's a broad outline, and then you go on to say in the statement, so if we can go back to the full page, so paragraph 20, you explain, as you've told us, the focus upon the NHS improvement as a priority for the government. And then if we go to the next page, paragraph 22, you say that you spent about 80% of your time on the chief executive role, but of course remained responsible for the provision of policy advice to ministers. And then you explain you were assisted on the policy advice side and in your permanent secretary role by, amongst others, Sir Liam Donaldson and Hugh Taylor, who became your successor as permanent secretary. So that's the reflection of the 4 days versus 1 day, so to speak. 80% of your time dealing with the responsibility for the running of the NHS, 20% of your time dealing with what would have, prior to that, have been a full-time role for one individual of being the most senior civil servant in the Department of Health.
That's right. The only caveat I would give is that I explicitly gave a lot more responsibility to my chief medical officer than I think permanent secretaries before or afterwards would have done. And he was extremely experienced and capable person, so I had a stronger support mechanism, if you like, than I think my predecessors or successors have had.
So the day-to-day work of leading on policy development within the Department of Health would have been essentially managed by the Chief Medical Officer insofar as it was clinical matters, and by Hugh Taylor and the civil servants reporting to Hugh Taylor or whoever his predecessor had been in relation to the more policy and resources side of matters.
Yes, that's broadly right. There is a little bit of overlap here, if you would like me just to clarify a little bit. So let me take an example of a policy that was introduced, which was nurse prescribing. Up until this point, only doctors could prescribe, but it became apparent that as part of this plan, it was really important that we allowed certain nurses and certain senior physiotherapists and pharmacists and others to prescribe. Now, that was something that was very much an NHS issue because it had arisen in the NHS. I mean, interestingly, it had arisen because there were some doctors in palliative care, in fact, who came to me to argue that they needed their nurses who understood what was going on, had a shared treatment plan to be able to increase people's dose of medicine. Now, that would, of course, have been managed within the Department of Health, but I had considerable input to that. And that, may I say, was a policy that was heavily contested by the doctors' organisations for reasons you may be able to, you can obviously imagine. So there would be areas like that where I personally got involved because it was of significant and immediate interest to the NHS.
And we'll see as we explore some of the issues in the course of the day that are of direct relevance to this inquiry, that a lot of what was happening in the Department of Health on those issues didn't come across your desk. So we won't be going through lots of documents that didn't come across your desk, but your second statement has set out in chronological order, for example, a number of documents in which the issue of whether there should be a public inquiry was explored. And for the most part, the vast majority of those documents don't get copied to you or to your office.
That's right. There would be a lot of things which would have gone to a normal permanent secretary, which didn't come to me because I had this delegation arrangement in place. And there were a lot of things that came to me which wouldn't have come to a permanent secretary, because they were things like, well, the one I described of radical change in how medicines are delivered, which were about what happened in the NHS today, if you like.
Now, we've heard evidence from and received evidence from civil servants in the 1980s and through into the 90s, in which the civil service structure within the Department of Health was what's been described as a parallel hierarchy of the medical officers reporting to the chief medical officer, and then the civil servants, the non-medical civil servants, administrative civil servants reporting to the permanent secretary. By the time you took up your post, that was no longer the system within the department, is that right?
That's right, and I, in a sense, took that further by giving the chief medical officer more managerial responsibility. He was accountable to me for the management of that, but he was accountable to the Secretary of State for the advice given to the Secretary of State. So he had an independent line as well as that.
In your second statement, I don't think we need to put it up on screen, but you say in relation to these two posts that you held that they were very different in scale and remit and required different skills. What were the different skills or the particular skills required for each of those roles in your view?
Well, the NHS, they were about getting things done. They were about management and delivery, and I had presumably quite a good record from the past of actually making improvements in the service. So they were about the here and now. In the other post, the permanent secretary post, they would be much more about process, if I can put it like that, because it is vitally important that we do have good processes and that we do prepare good legislation and so on. And I didn't have background and experience about that, but I did obviously have background and experience about the other one.
Now, in terms of the ministers who were in place at the Department of Health during your time, if we take this from your second statement, so Lawrence, if we could have WITN 3996026, please. And if we could go to page 7. We can see the Secretaries of State for Health with whom you dealt are listed at the top of the page: Alan Milburn, followed by John Reid, both of whom the inquiry has heard from, followed by Patricia Hewitt. The Ministers of State: John Hutton, followed by John Denham, Jackie Smith and Rosie Winterton. And then Parliamentary Under Secretaries of State in the Lords and Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Public Health in the Commons. Predominantly Lord Philip Hunt, brief period Baroness Andrews, and then Lord Norman Warner. And his name is of some significance because we'll look at some correspondence between Lord Jenkin and Lord Warner in due course. And then Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Public Health, Yvette Cooper, Hazel Blears, Melanie Johnson and Caroline Flint. We've heard from a number of ministers of the extent to which they had regular meetings with their senior civil servants, including their permanent secretary. Given that you had this dual role, what was the extent of your regular interaction with ministers?
Oh, it was every Monday at 9 o'clock, or depending on when the trains arrived from Darlington, I would meet with the Secretary of State for at least half an hour or so to think about what had happened over the weekend and what was going to happen during the week. That was something that it was the most fixed item in my diary. So that was the one regular meeting that I had to make sure that I and he were in the same position, because the Secretary of State would be the one other person like me who had the NHS and the Department of Health. Then secondly, the Ministers of State, so John Denham, John Hutton, Rosie Winterton and Jackie Smith, they were the people who typically had responsibility for the management of the NHS. So they would be the other people who I would meet with very regularly. And then to some extent the Minister in the Lords, but that's because the Minister in the Lords covers everything. And there's only one, whereas all the other ministers are in the Commons. So those would be my most regular contacts. And in an ordinary week, I would probably meet a minister 5 or 6 or 7 times, if I was in London, undoubtedly every day I'd meet one.
And then in terms of the Chief Medical Officer,
Yeah.
how frequent were your meetings with him?
Well, pretty much the same, I would say, actually. I mean, I would have thought I probably saw him about 2 or 3 times a week.
Now, in terms of your dealings with ministers, whether it's the Secretary of State, Minister for Health, or the Parliamentary Under-Secretaries of State, I don't think we have any record which suggests that you had direct interactions with ministers on some of the issues central to this inquiry.
Yeah.
But more generally, to what extent was it your experience that ministers would challenge, probe, seek to change direction from that which was being advised to them by civil servants, or was it very much a more passive role and of going along with what the advice was from civil servants?
I think there were 13 or 14 ministers here, so you can imagine there was a complete range. There would be some people, and Alan Milburn would be a classic, who would challenge quite regularly. John Reid would challenge on very specific points. One of the characteristics of government in the UK is that the personality and ability of the ministers to some extent influences priorities and behaviours, as you will understand, the person in charge. So some of them challenged very hard, and some of them who were perhaps less familiar with health, particularly when they came in, and some of these ministers weren't really in post terribly long, wouldn't challenge as much because they knew less how to challenge, perhaps, or where to challenge. So it's a real mix.
Now, we can take that down, thank you, Lawrence. One of the features we've discussed in evidence with other witnesses has been the extent of turnover of ministers within the Department of Health. Was that something which you got a sense from the civil servants within the department was regarded as problematic or frustration?
Oh, I think so, but I think they were used to it, actually, probably, would be the honest truth. I mean, my Secretary of State knew I thought we had too many ministers, because when I started, we had 5, and we then later had 6, and I felt that we could have had fewer, because that also complicates matters, and you will have seen from, and this is part, of course, what I was talking about when the system not serving people well, is that you sometimes saw in the record things being passed from one minister to another. So there was a lot of handoffs and so on. So I think it's a significant problem, and I think some civil servants found it frustrating. Civil servants also turn over reasonably quickly.
In terms of the devolved nations, so Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, various different stages of devolved power at that point in time, the point in time in which you were at the Department of Health. To what extent did you have any sort of regular interaction with officials in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland?
I think I may have in my time maybe as much as, well, not even once a year, met the people from Wales and the chief executives from Wales and Scotland. Their structures were slightly different. There was a chief executive in Wales. There was essentially a permanent secretary in Scotland. But I had very little personal contact. The chief medical officers and the chief nursing officers of the 4 nations met regularly.
And do you have any sense of the extent to which the civil servants below you in the hierarchy, whether there was more regular contact at civil service level?
Well, I think there will have been on some issues. I think of the fact that quite a lot of the law governing the NHS related to England and Wales, so one would tend to see more contact between England and Wales on issues such as the National Institute for now the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, and so on. So there will have been regular contact around some of those very live issues, but it would have been a case-by-case basis, I would have thought.
Now, again, in relation to some of the earlier periods of time that the inquiry has explored, there was not the post or position of special advisor. But I think by the time you were in post, special advisors were a feature of the way in which ministers received advice and operated. How did it work, that the special advisor role, during your time at the Department of Health, as far as you can recall?
Well, this was even more different than the different ministers, because the quality of the special advisors and their knowledge varied enormously, depending on who they were. And you would tend to get two sorts: one who are related to policy and one who are related to communications and politics. So you would, I think most Secretary of States probably had two, and I think one of them was the one who advised them on the politics of the situation, if I can put it like that, and the communications around it, and another one who was more knowledgeable about health. I suppose that's the answer. They would tend to sit in on meetings at the discretion of the minister, and they would be there quite a lot of the time. Yeah.
Was there any system in place within the Department of Health during your time there for reviewing or checking whether pre-existing policies, pre-existing lines to take should be maintained or should be altered? We'll come to some specific examples later, but just in general terms, was there anything of that nature?
Well, given that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of policies and lines to take, no, there was no general system that said they had to be reviewed after 3 years or anything of that sort. That would essentially be the responsibility of the branches or the divisions or lower in the system, except that when a line to take was put up to a minister, I would have expected the person at the time to check it, so that I, as a permanent secretary or a minister, got the most up-to-date version, if you like.
And again, we may pick up on that in relation to some specific examples.
Yeah.
So I want to turn now to some issues relating to document loss, document destruction, and your interactions with Lord Jenkin.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I just want to look at some guidance within the Department of Health from your time about how documents should be reviewed, stored and retained. Yeah. I'm going to pick it up with two documents that predate your appointment, so they're from the 1990s, just by way of background.
Yeah.
WITN 6955036, please, Lawrence. So this is a minute from the then permanent secretary, Graham Hart. Was he your immediate predecessor?
No.
But he was permanent secretary in any event in May 1994, and this is a minute sent to all Department of Health staff. Departmental Document Management Initiative. There have been considerable changes in departmental organisation and staffing over the past few years, which have led to weaknesses in departmental record keeping. Further, the introduction of OAS has changed the way in which business is done. 2, the department continues to need traceable records for 3 reasons: to ensure we can account for actions taken, to enable us to take action that is consistent with our past statements and actions, and to avoid inefficient searching for material. Open government strengthens the requirement for good records. And then paragraph 3 explains a rolling programme of work to improve record keeping. And then if we go to paragraph 4, as a start, each member of staff needs to be aware of their responsibility, and the accompanying leaflet for the record is being issued to you and all members of the department. So, Lord Crisp, I'm just going to take you through a handful of these documents just so that we can lay the groundwork for the interactions that you then had with Lord Jenkin and others. So the leaflet that was referred to in paragraph 4 of Mr. Hart's minute is at WITN 6955037. We can see it's called for the record, bottom of the page. I'm not going to go through all of it, but if we go to page 2, please, Lawrence, we can see under the heading Why Keep Records, the leaflet emphasises this. Good record keeping is an essential part of the work of any government department and is largely the result of efficient filing. It is important to keep a record of the work done by the Department of Health so that those coming after you can find out what has been done or not done on a particular case or issue. Any decisions made can be justified or reconsidered at a later date, and you can work with maximum efficiency without having to waste time hunting for vital documents. Good records are especially important in cases such as medical liability, parliamentary accountability, and negotiations with outside bodies. The general move towards more openness and easier access to records has increased the need for good records management. So those two documents combined, Mr. Hart's minute, this leaflet, sets out some of the importance of having proper records maintained within the Department of Health and kept. And would you agree with the importance attached to records that we see here?
Absolutely. I think I would actually, just looking at that, add a point about there's also something about maintaining something for history as a public record. But I think those are good descriptions.
And then we can pick them up, and indeed the point that you've just made, I think, in the more detailed document that you've exhibited to your first statement. So this is WITN 3996002. And you explain in your statement, we don't need to go to it, but you say in paragraph 29, this was the guidance that applied during your time as Permanent Secretary and Chief Executive.
Yeah.
It's called A Guide for Records Managers and Reviewing Officers. And if we look over the page, we see the date of issue as July 1994. So that ties in, I think, with what we saw from Mr. Hart. Again, I won't go through all of it. But in part to lay the foundation and groundwork for some of the evidence we'll hear this week. If we could go to page 7. We see here it says, keeping good records is fundamental to the day-to-day running of the Department of Health. Much of the work we do has long-term consequences, and accurate records are essential if future users are to be able to see why certain decisions were made or why certain things did or did not happen. Well-kept records become particularly important when, and then we see the same examples given, including cases of medical liability. And then if we go over the page, we can see reference there to the Public Records Acts, 1958 and 1967. I'm not going to quiz you about their requirements, Lord Crisp. And then the definition of a public record, the Act define all DH records as public records. If we then go to the next page, it's just one paragraph I wanted to ask you about. So this has described the structure of the public record system. Again, I'm not going to go through with you the system of local registries and the Departmental Records Office and the Public Records Office and so on. But that first paragraph there, the individual, each person is responsible for ensuring that there is a complete record of their work in the official registered files. And then there's reference to another guide, which I don't at the moment have the URN for, but we'll locate that. What, if any, understanding either did you have at the time or do you have now of what's meant by that individual responsibility for individuals to record their own work in writing?
Well, I think two things. One is that where they are in correspondence with others outside the department and where they may be the only person on the list or whatever, that they have a responsibility to consider whether that should be included in the appropriate file in the local registry. So I think there's a bit about going external. I think there's also a bit about not recording. A complete record of their work is rather ambiguous, isn't it, in terms of not a sort of timesheet for things, but the key things that they were doing, that they were recording, key meetings and so on, that those should be, I would assume, put into the record. But I think there's quite a lot of room for interpretation of what a complete record is.
And leaving aside whatever might be said in the guide that's referred to there,
Yeah.
which we can obviously check for ourselves, as a matter of good management and good decision making and good record keeping, would you say that not only important meetings, but anything which evidences the advice that's being given, whether to senior officials or to ministers, or the decisions that are being taken and the reasons for those decisions, on significant matters, not on how many paper clips to purchase or anything like that. Would you expect those to be recorded in some shape or another and then the records kept?
I think so. I think there is some exceptions to that, aren't there, in possibly the other document that one's talk about, perhaps the private offices of ministers, where they're getting advice from external parties, and there is something about the privacy of the advice between the Secretary of State and their principal advisors, which for the when those principal advisors are within the Department of Health rather than the people externally, much of that should be preserved, but it may want to be preserved for long periods in order not to get caught up in the politics of the day, which is what I understand would happen if these things were available early on.
So on any view, you'd expect that kind of material to be preserved. The extent to which they are then open to the public to scrutinise, there might be different time periods depending upon
I think
the
so,
nature of the advice.
but I think there is some kind of exception, isn't there, for special advisors and others?
Yes, and we'll look at that second document shortly.
Yeah.
If we then just go on to page 11 of this document, we can see under the heading Types of Files, there's described three main types of registered or official files: the policy files, the particular instance papers, and the private office files.
Yeah.
If we just look at the definition of policy files, these are the most frequently used type of file. They contain either records on a particular subject or administrative or financial records. And then the private office files deal with MPs' inquiries or with parliamentary questions opened and dealt with in the private office or specialist sections. Now, again, I'm not going to go through then the detail of how files were opened and assigned numbers and so on. But if we go to page 17 next, just want to pick up on what should be filed. So this is, as I understand it, the question of what documents should then be placed physically in the policy file. Any item should be filed that contains, or generally any item should be filed that contain information or work done on the file subject, show the reasons why something has been accepted or rejected, or why something has been done or not done, show who was involved in any decision making or work done, contain financial papers or statistics relating to the file subject, or which relate to the success or failure of any work or project associated with the file subject, or success or failure to meet target standards or other criteria. Now, to some extent, that might seem a fairly straightforward statement of the obvious. You'd expect that to be the way in which the department organised its affairs.
I think so, although you'd also expect a degree of common sense, because these are very catch-all sort of phrases, aren't they? And I think the training programme will have helped people to understand what was meant by that. I would imagine that I mean, because later on it talks about the training programs that were applied. So people will have had to apply some judgment as to exactly what needs to go in. Otherwise, you really are putting in minutiae. But the general point is clear.
I assume you would not have had any knowledge of the training programs in the 90s that were given to civil servants on these issues.
No.
Do you know what, if any, ongoing training civil servants received during your time in office?
No.
If we then go to page 30...
Except that I think this document, which was live, this document, as I read it, was updated during my time, wasn't it? I think that's what it said on the front page. And this contains what needs to be covered. It contains some level of a training programme, so I'm assuming that this would have run through.
If we go to page 33... This then looks at the question of reviewing files in order to decide whether they should be destroyed or kept. So it says, as each file is different and holds a variety of information, each one has to be considered or reviewed separately when deciding whether it should be destroyed or kept. Officially, files are recommended for review 2 years after the date of the last action. Each registry decides with the records management advisor at the DRO at what stage the branch is to review files and so on. And then if we go to the heading reviewing policy files in the branch, all policy files are reviewed in the branch. The branch reviewing officer must be grade EO or above. That's executive officer, EO. What level of seniority is that?
Well, it is, I don't know how you describe it, but it's not the most senior. No.
The officer is appointed by branch line, also not the most junior, as I understand. The officer is appointed by branch line management and must have a thorough knowledge of the administrative needs of the branch. The registry officer refers the files due for review to the branch reviewing officer, who decides whether it is to be, and then this is the first category, destroyed at first review. This decision is made when files have no further administrative value at all, or, over the page, only a short to medium term continuing administrative need. If the file has no further administrative value, then it may be destroyed 2 years from the date of the last document. If it has limited administrative value, it may be spared destruction until any date between 2 and 15 years from the date of the last document. So is it right to understand that that's a judgment that's made by the branch reviewing officer? They have to evaluate the contents of the file and reach a judgment as to whether either of those criteria are satisfied.
There's something which comes somewhere else in this document, which is quite important in applying these rules, which is duplication. Because there is a danger that you will get an awful lot of the, particularly emails that are copied around to a lot of people. So it does say somewhere that you've also got to be clear about duplication.
And then retained by the DRO for a second review. Retaining a file for a second review means that it will be kept until the first paper is 25 years old. As storing files for this length of time is costly, it's not a decision to be taken lightly. Files that are kept for second review are likely to be needed for long-term administrative reasons or have potential historical or research value. So that, I think, picks up on the additional point that you made a few minutes ago, Lord Crisp. And then files retained for second review because of the latter, so the potential historical or research value, will hold details either of the DH's history, its organisation and procedures, the formulation of policy and legislation, or more selectively its implementation and interpretation, notable events or persons not available elsewhere, major events, developments or trends in political, social or economic history. Top of the next page, please. Scientific, technological and medical developments, regional or local conditions, where information is either not available locally or convenient to hold it centrally, or statistical or quantitative research useful for demographic, medical, social or economic history. And then this, when a decision has been reached, the BRO, branch reviewing officer, completes the review decision box on the file cover. If the BRO considers the file to have potential historical or research value, a minute should be placed on the file giving brief reasons for the decision as well as completing the file cover. So again, quite an exercise of judgment required by the branch reviewing officer. Now, if we just go back to page 33, just under the first paragraph under the heading Reviewing Policy Files in the Branch, it says in the last sentence of that first paragraph that the officer must have a thorough knowledge of the administrative needs of the branch. Do you have any insight or knowledge of how the branch reviewing officers might be expected to get a sense of the significance or otherwise, the administrative value or otherwise of a document?
Well, I would have thought that the head of the branch would have regular meetings with their team, and that this person, the branch reviewing officer, would necessarily be part of that team. These are not big, large numbers of people. And I would have thought and have hoped that that they would have a thorough understanding of the work of the branch, you know. And in a small team, by and large, people should know what other people are doing or what's being covered.
And then if we just go to the next page,
Yeah.
Leaving aside any question of duplication, which duplication might itself afford a freestanding ground for not needing to keep something if it's already kept in near identical form. But would it be fair to say that files evidencing decision-making regarding blood and blood product safety are the kinds of material you would expect to be regarded as needed for long-term administrative reasons and maintained?
Oh, I think so, yeah. Yeah, no, I understand the point you're making is that, I would have thought that in broad terms, yes.
Now, if we just go, just to complete the picture in relation to the process, we go to page 37. There's a paragraph or a section there on private office files. Private office files not reviewed at all. Once the final reply has been sent to the MP, the files may be sent to the DRO for storage. They're kept there for 3 years before being destroyed. Some branches file private office files in local registries, etc. If you need to keep private office files as a reference to provide examples for model answers for other inquiries, you may retain them for up to 3 years. Now, that appears to be viewing private office files as largely limited to correspondence with MPs. I'm not sure whether you can tell us any more about your understanding of private office files other than what's set out in the second document exhibited to your statement, which we'll come back to. Okay. And then what happens after branch review? We can see we see the importance of what's the decision by the branch reviewing officer, because once that's done, the registry officer just essentially checks the dates from the first bullet point, and then the third bullet point sends the file to the DRO to await destruction on first review date or for long-term storage to await second review. So there's no second level review of the decision of the branch reviewing officer under this guidance.
There's no second level?
It's not a preliminary decision by the branch reviewing officer that's then looked at by somebody else.
No.
The decision is essentially implemented in the way described here.
Yes.
And so if it's been marked for destruction on first review, that's what will happen. It will be destroyed.
That's my understanding, yeah.
It's right to say there is then an ability to change decisions. It says if the branch realises the wrong decision has been entered on a file cover, the BRO must, and then there's provision for the decision to be revised. And then if we see the bottom of the page, destroy at first review, when the date for destruction at first review is reached, the DRO will destroy the file without further reference to the branch. Second review, on the next page. So this is where the branch reviewing officer has decided that it should be retained, which means retention until the first paper is 25 years old. So we have the second review, and then there's a decision as to whether to select it for permanent preservation in the Public Records Office or destroy it. And then retaining files after second review and this obviously describes the position at the time you were in post, Lord Chris, but I don't think it's necessarily an accurate description of the current position, I should say. Retaining files after second review, a registry may retain a file until the last document held in it is 30 years old. After that, it may only be kept with the permission of the Lord Chancellor. And then over the page, there's reference for transfer to the Public Records Office. Now, as you say, there is provision in relation to, I think, training and the like further on in this document. And there's a workbook that starts on page 50 of the document. I'm not going to take time going through that. But there are training documents that we can see as part of this material.
Well, this is a delegated system, as you are drawing out, which is an important principle, and it's very important that to make that work, people have proper training and supervision.
And then can I take you back to your first statement, so WITN 3996001. If we go to page 6, first of all. Having referred in paragraph 29 to that guidance, as well as to some guidance about private office papers that we'll come back to, over the next page, you say this in paragraphs 30 to 31. In answer to the question raised by the inquiry of the procedure that anyone destroying DH documents would have to follow, there would have been a clear expectation that destruction of documents should only occur in accordance with the applicable document retention policies. And then you say in paragraph 31, I've been asked for details of circumstances in which this procedure would not be followed either intentionally or in error. There should be no circumstances in which the policy is intentionally not followed. Human error is always a risk, but the policy in training and records management would have been designed to seek to reduce that risk. So your expectation as Permanent Secretary would be that guidance would be adhered to. There's no circumstance whatsoever in which someone should deliberately destroy something not in accordance with that guidance.
No, I'm not sure it's guidance. I think it's policy.
So then just to look at the second of the two pieces of guidance that you have referred to in paragraph 29 of your witness statement.
Right.
This is at WITN 3996003. And this is guidance on the management of private office papers, and your statement tells us it was issued in July 2001.
Yeah.
We can look at the bottom of the page. This booklet sets out guidance on the management of private office papers. It's drafted in terms of ministers, but also includes permanent secretaries' offices. And then good records management procedures within private offices are necessary to meet statutory obligations, etc., to enable departments to produce, as evidence to inquiries, original paper submissions to ministers, including any annotations they may have made or where business is transacted electronically, a note recording ministers' comments or lack of them. And I draw attention to that, Lord Chris, for reasons you'll understand, because there are original paper submissions that the inquiry does not have. Reduce the risks associated with litigation by making it easier to identify and retrieve relevant information. Over the page. Ensure accountability and provide an audit trail which relays the views of the minister to the appropriate policy area. And 5, protect information, which is a valuable resource. And then paragraph 1.3 tells us that this is the first central guidance to be issued in respect of private office papers, although some existing guidance notes touch on various aspects of these records. These notes supplement existing guidance, they're not intended to replace them. Just pausing there, do you know why it wasn't until 2001 that central guidance was issued in relation to private office papers, or what it was that triggered the issuing of this guidance? I wonder if there was something that was issued centrally across government that this was picking up on. I wonder if that might be the timing, but I don't know. But that might be quite likely, actually. And then scope of guidance 2.1, private offices are here defined as comprising ministers and permanent secretaries' offices. However, there's no reason why the records management advice outlined here shouldn't be applied to other offices of senior public servants, for example, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Nursing Officer, etc. And then 2.2 deals separately with the papers of special advisors, prima facie in a separate category, to the extent that their papers only mirror those existing elsewhere in the department or are concerned with party or parliamentary business, there's no reason to keep them. If, however, special advisors were to have a wider role in the department, only those records originating in a special advisor's office relating to policy or presentational advice should be kept. And then, I'm not going to again go through the detail of it, but if we just pick it up at the bottom of page 4, there's a heading, Best Practice in Managing Private Office Papers, at the very bottom of the page. And then if we go on to page 5, paragraph 6.1 recommends that all private offices should follow one of 2 models. Model 1, paragraph 6.3, is the papers being sent by the private offices to the departmental policy areas and ensuring that all the papers on a particular subject are filed together. And we can see under the heading Paper Records, there's a particular reference to submissions. Send all original submissions and other action papers as annotated by the Minister or a private secretary note back to the policy area to be placed on the appropriate registered file. And then there is an explanation, essentially, that there should be something to reflect whether ministers have seen the document or not. So that's model 1, whereby it's then dealt with through the DRO route. And then model 2, if we go over the page, about 6.4, the following model is more appropriate where ministers need to keep their papers close at hand. And then it explains that this model involves private offices accepting a greater responsibility for their papers. And then it describes the private offices essentially retaining a number of the papers and then sets out the process that should be followed. So would it be right to understand that whatever the precise trigger for the issue of this guidance, which, as you say, applied across government, not limited to the Department of Health, it places a particular emphasis on the importance of understanding and retaining the advice given to ministers and the input that ministers had in considering that advice? Is that fair? Now, I'm just going to turn now to the correspondence with the meetings with Lord Jenkin, but I see the time, sir, so it might be sensible to start that after our normal mid-morning break.
Well, yes, let's do that then. We'll take a break until 11:45. 11:45.
And, sir, could you give Lord Crisp the usual explanation for witnesses?
Yes, I will. Lord Crisp, you're giving evidence under oath. What I say to every witness is that at this break, indeed at any break, you are not allowed to discuss with anyone, whoever that person is, anything you have been asked about in evidence or anything which you think you may yet be asked about in the course of your evidence. You're free to talk about anything else you like. 11:45. Thank you.